CRPGs are ultimately derivative of tabletop games, specifically Dungeons & Dragons, first emerging in 1974. And although much has changed since then, in terms of systems and details, one thing has remained constant: the fact that it has remained a realm of imagination. Dungeons & Dragons, at its core, is about storytelling, and storytelling allows for potentially limitless possibilities as concerns its stories and adventures. I mention this because this fundamentally needs to be borne in mind anytime we talk about CRPGs that are derived from tabletop. Some things will inevitably be different. The biggest limitation in a CRPG is that no matter how many twists and turns, alternative endings, choices, and details there are, it is by its very nature finite, in a way that tabletop is not. And this means that many things that work well or have good potential in a tabletop campaign may not do so in a CRPG. And I want to specifically talk about wizards and sorcerers here, but first I want to reference an example of just such a class that is very interesting in a tabletop setting, but absolutely fails in a CRPG. The game of Pathfinder is another tabletop RPG, ultimately and originally derived from Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition, which now sports its own CRPGs, and like D&D, it too faces difficulties in the translation of tabletop to screen. And in this context, I want to talk about the class from Pathfinder called the Investigator, which is basically a version of a fantasy sleuth, a cunning and curious class that involves making use of discovery, knowledge, clues, trap finding, as well as alchemy, and other talents. Such a class is great in tabletop because it allows for flexibility and the ability to handle and prepare for many different situations and environments, reflecting the imaginative power of a game master and the endless possibilities that can be thrown at players and their ability to creatively react to such situations. But in a much more linear, tightly woven narrative of the sort found in, say, a game such as Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, which is a CRPG, it would not work as well because the game is necessarily predictable. Although this class is not officially available, there is a mod that introduces it, and it suffers from all the problems that would be predicted in a largely linear computer game. The lesson to be learned here is that flexibility and variety are best rewarded in a setting that itself is flexible and variable, which is what tabletop is and what a CRPG is not. Let us now address the wizard versus sorcerer dilemma. Now, this was arguably already a problem in the first Baldur's Gate games, 1 and 2, after sorcerers were introduced. Sorcerers at the time knew fewer spells, but could cast them more frequently than wizards, and spontaneously. This is also true in the Pathfinder games, by the way. Veterans balk at the idea of using a wizard other than in some role-playing sense, because frankly speaking, sorcerers are just better. Why? Because they can cast more spells, spontaneously, i.e. without preparation, and always have their full spell list available. You may be beginning to understand the dilemma. Spell preparation is good when there are unknowns in the mix, when the environment is variable, and when encounters are unfamiliar and unpredictable. All scenarios that are endemic to pen and paper, but alien to a CRPG, no matter how good it might be. Fundamentally, the problem lies in the natural finiteness of a CRPG. The first time you play it, you don't know what's going to happen. Will this spell be good? Will this skill set be important or useful? What if I take that proficiency? This is in itself an exciting process, as you're about to embark upon a new adventure, and a wizard might even be good for that first run. But before you even finish the game, maybe even halfway through, it begins to dawn on you that many situations repeat themselves. Maybe only some proficiencies seem really useful. Perhaps even worse, there's only really a handful of spells that seem worth using, because of a variety of situations that continually crop up. All of a sudden, you realize that your elaborate spell list as a wizard, and the gold you've invested copying spells into your spellbook, just wasn't worth it. You finish the game, and you've enjoyed it, but when you do your second playthrough, since you already know the ins and outs of the game and what's going to happen, you're definitely going to do things differently. Whether you played a wizard or not, your character and the choices you make for him are going to be much more formulaic, predictable, and tailored to the finite experience of the game. And that is naturally going to exclude a lot of options and a lot of choices you might have otherwise made in a pen and paper setting, because many of us are at the very least minimally power gamers and want effective builds and setups. If it turns out that animal handling is a near useless skill, which I'm not claiming by the way, I'm just using it as an example, then you won't be using it or putting proficiency points into it. because it serves no practical purpose in the game. And this isn't by any means unique to Baldur's Gate 3, but a hard-coded feature of any CRPG. No one likes bad builds, inefficiency, and useless skills, so we get rid of them and take the things that are good and work for us. BG3 will not be unique in this sense, and already in early access there are some things that we know are better than others. And this applies to all classes. Some ranger pets are better than others, some spells are better than others, and the Battle Master is probably a better archetype than the Eldritch Knight. And so it goes and so it goes. All of this said, I think when contemplating the differences between 5th edition wizards and their sorcerers counterparts, it isn't nearly as bad as it used to be in 2nd and 3rd edition. Sorcerers aren't outclassing wizards purely in terms of being able to cast many more spells like it used to be, which in former times made them the clear winner. Wizards in Baldur's Gate 3, I believe, still have something to bring to the table, not only in light of specialties, which I've talked about in the previous video, some of which have fairly unique things to offer, such as the Diviner abilities to avoid attacks, or the Necromancer's ability to create more zombies, but also in terms of abilities like Arcane Recovery, which the Sorcerer does not have. Of course, the value of Arcane Recovery will also be contingent on whether or not we can rest, and we don't know how frequently we'll be able to rest in the final product. But at the moment in early access, it's not a big deal at all. Sorcerers, however, do have meta magic, which technically is more powerful and flexible, and might win out in the end, especially upon the 2nd and 3rd playthroughs. Things like Heightened and Quickened Spell are difficult to overlook seen from this light. And this isn't really a balancing issue, since it's an inherent limitation in every CRPG. And even if we were to set aside the differences between these two arcane classes, it would still apply to everything else, as I've already mentioned, from cleric domains to proficiencies to equipment as banal as boots, as well as weapons and armor. Versatility and responsiveness to new situations in a class or any other feature will always be somewhat downgraded in a computer game, but it is possible to minimize just how bad that might get, and I do have the sneaking suspicion that Larian might be the studio to at least partly be able to pull that off. And for the record, as I've already stated a few times, a Deep Gnome Necromancer is a very serious top consideration for me on my first playthrough of the full game. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoy the content, please leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe, as it really helps out the channel, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.